The Grand Canyon, millions of people visit every year, and you'd think we know it pretty well. Its history seems carved in stone, a straightforward story of geology and the ancient Native American tribes who called it home for over a century. That's been the official story, but what if it isn't the whole story? What if, hidden somewhere deep inside those canyon walls, is evidence of a lost civilization? A discovery so stunning, it was deliberately buried more than 100 years ago. Back in 1909, a newspaper ran a front-page story about an explorer who claimed he'd found a massive underground city complete with Egyptian artifacts. And then the story just vanished. Today, we're reopening that century-old case. But we're not just looking for a lost city. We're asking a bigger question. Amidst the sensational headlines and conspiracy theories, what is the true human story of the Grand Canyon? A story that is even more profound than any legend. It all started on April 5, 1909. The Arizona Gazette published a sensational front-page article, Explorations in Grand Canyon. It told the wild tale of an adventurer, G.E. Kincaid, who supposedly made the most important archaeological find in North America. The paper described Kincaid as an explorer and hunter who had worked for the Smithsonian Institution for 30 years and was on a solo trip down the Colorado River. Somewhere in the Marble Canyon area, Kincaid said, he spotted stains in the sedimentary formations high on the canyon wall, so he started climbing. He claimed the cave he found was perched almost 2,000 feet up a sheer cliff, making it nearly impossible to reach. But when he got there, he saw that the entrance wasn't natural. It had been carved by human hands, according to the article. Kincaid grabbed his gun and went inside. What he described next was staggering. This wasn't just a cave. It was the entrance to a huge underground citadel, methodically carved from solid rock. The newspaper story claimed it was inhabited by a lost race with clear origins in the ancient East. The report was incredibly specific, presenting Kincaid's story as fact. It even named a professor, S.A. Jordan, who was allegedly sent by the Smithsonian to lead a full-scale investigation. This discovery, the paper declared, would rewrite history. And then, after that single, explosive article, nothing. The Arizona Gazette never mentioned it again. The biggest find in history was apparently discovered and forgotten in a single day. That silence is the real mystery. To really get a grip on what was being claimed, we have to imagine what Kincaid said he saw. This wasn't a small settlement. He described a massive complex of tunnels and rooms big enough to house 50,000 people. The artifacts he supposedly found were what made the story truly unbelievable. Kincaid described rooms filled with copper and gold urns, stone tablets covered in strange hieroglyphs, and an idol of a figure sitting cross-legged holding a lotus flower, almost like a Buddha. And then there were the mummies, but let's contrast that fantasy with the real treasures found in the Grand Canyon. The oldest human artifacts discovered here are nearly 12,000 years old, dating back to the Paleo-Indian period. These include fragments of Clovis spear points used by Ice Age hunters to take down mammoths and giant sloths. Instead of golden urns, archaeologists have found beautiful pottery made by the ancestral Puebloan people who lived in the canyon around 1,000 years ago. They built stunning cliff dwellings and granaries high on the canyon walls, some of which you can still see today, and perhaps most mysterious of all are the split-twig figurines. These 4,000-year-old objects, carefully crafted from a single willow twig to resemble deer and bighorn sheep, were not toys, they were left in remote caves, sometimes pierced with a tiny spear, likely as totems in sacred hunting rituals. With a story this wild, the first thing you do is check the source. And this is where it all starts to fall apart. The 1909 article leans heavily on the credibility of the Smithsonian Institution, but when you ask the Smithsonian about it today, their answer is clear and has never changed. They have zero records of A.G.E. Kincaid or a Professor S.A. Jordan. They deny ever funding an expedition like this, and they state they have no Egyptian artifacts from the Grand Canyon. For believers, that denial isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of a conspiracy. The theory goes that the Smithsonian did find everything but bury the discovery. Proponents claim the government has made the area a forbidden zone to hide the entrance. And while it's true that many caves in the Grand Canyon are off-limits, the National Park Service is clear this is to preserve fragile ecosystems, and the thousands of real archaeological sites not to hide a secret city. Believers also point to place names in the canyon like Cheops Pyramid, Isis Temple, and Buddha Temple as proof. But historians say these names were given in the late 19th and early 20th centuries by surveyors and explorers like Clarence Dutton and George Wharton James. It was a trend at the time, reflecting a popular fascination with ancient mythology. To a skeptic, it's a coincidence. To a believer, it's a map hiding in plain sight. When you dig into it, you're left with three main possibilities. First, and most likely, the whole thing was a hoax. In the early 1900s, yellow journalism was common. Newspapers would print sensational stories to grab readers' attention, and facts were sometimes optional. It's very possible a writer at the Arizona Gazette just made it all up. On a slow news day, the complete lack of photos or follow-up articles is a major red flag. The second theory is that the story sprouted from a kernel of truth. The Grand Canyon is filled with real archaeological sites for at least 12,000 years. Humans have lived in and passed through this landscape. From the Paleo-Indians and the Archaic desert cultures to the ancestral Puebloans, the canyon has been a home, a travel route, and a sacred place. The ancestral Puebloans, for example, built communities along the Colorado River, leaving behind pottery, tools, and circular kivas for ceremonies. It's possible someone found a genuine Native American burial site, or a large cliff dwelling, and through a game of historical, telephone, and sensational reporting, Puebloan pottery became Egyptian urns, and ancient petroglyphs were twisted into foreign hieroglyphs. The third theory is the one that keeps the legend alive, that it's all true and we're all being lied to. This theory is fueled by a deep distrust of authority. In this view, the complete lack of evidence isn't a problem, it's proof. Every denial from the Smithsonian just feeds the conspiracy. This theory doesn't rely on facts but fills the vacuum of evidence with speculation. So, after all this time, what have we actually found? The search for G.E. Kincaid's lost city doesn't lead to a cave filled with gold, but to something far more valuable, a profound story of human history written in the rock. The hard, verifiable evidence for Kincaid's citadel is zero. The story of an Egyptian Buddhist colony in the Grand Canyon is almost certainly a piece of early 20th century fake news. But the real archaeology of the Grand Canyon is an incredible, documented story of human endurance and ingenuity. There are over 4,000 documented archaeological sites in the region. We have evidence of continuous human presence stretching back 12,000 years. This includes the enigmatic split-twig figurines of the Archaic period, the intricate baskets of the Basketmaker culture, and the impressive cliffside villages and ceremonial kivas of the ancestral Puebloans. This is the true lost history, a story of how different cultures adapted, survived, and thrived for millennia in one of Earth's most challenging landscapes. So the real revelation isn't what Kincaid found, but what his story shows us about ourselves. The legend survives because we love a good mystery. But in searching for a fantasy, we risk overlooking the magnificent truth that's right in front of us. The canyon doesn't hold a single lost civilization, it holds the heritage of many. The Grand Canyon will always hold its secrets. And while Kincaid's underground city seems destined to remain a legend, the real human history of this place is just as compelling. It's a story told not in a single newspaper article, but in thousands of artifacts, dwellings, and sacred sites left behind by people over 12 millennia. It pushes us to ask what if. But it also grounds us in the proven, awe-inspiring story of human persistence, the search for answers. Whether in documented ruins or ancient artifacts is what keeps the true spirit of exploration alive. If you enjoyed this investigation into the real history of the Grand Canyon, make sure you subscribe and hit that bell icon. You won't want to miss where our search for history's authentic stories takes us next.